afternoon. Thank you for joining the Federal Fiscal Compliance and Reporting Division for its annual Indirect Cost Rates training. This training pertains to how school districts request indirect cost rates for the 22-23 school year. And that involves the indirect cost rate proposal, completing the additional cost workbook, and certification. So we'll delve into the details of completing the ICRP, ACW, and certifying the ICRP. As a reminder, this training is about how school districts request and completely require paperwork or additional costs to request an indirect cost rate. It does not apply to charter schools because their rates are calculated in a completely different way. So again, this is
Kathy, I'm sorry to interrupt, Kathy, but your sound is real muffled. Maybe mute your mic and then turn it back on and try again.
Okay.
It's got a bad echo. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay, how about now? Is it any better?
Sounds way better. You are good.
All right. Sorry about
Thank
that,
you.
folks. Okay, I'm going to start over. I'm going to say, I'll start from the top. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining the Federal Fiscal Compliance and Reporting Division this afternoon for its annual Indirect Cost Rates training. This training pertains to how school districts request indirect cost rates for the 22-23 school year. Of course, most of you have rates for this year, and so this is the process that we start for issuing rates for next school year. We'll go over the indirect cost rate proposal, the additional cost workbook, and the certification process. We're going to delve into the details of completing the ICRP, ACW, and the certification process. So as a reminder, this training pertains to school districts only. And it does not apply to charter schools because charter schools have a completely different way of getting their rates. So, and then another thing I'd like to mention is that if you've done indirect cost rates in the past, you'll see that our training today is essentially the same as our training last year. We've just updated the dates. There have been no changes in our process. Our process is consistent and stays the same. So this will be pretty much the same training. As I said, just with updated dates. This next slide is our standard disclaimer, and it's a reminder that this presentation and slide deck reflect TEA's current understanding of the federal laws and guidance related to the issuance of indirect cost rates. However, this guidance does not constitute legal advice, and so LEAs are advised to seek legal counsel regarding any of this information before acting on such information and guidance. Since this is in webinar format, you will not be able to unmute and speak or ask your questions. So be sure to type any of your questions into the Q&A feature. We'll try to answer and respond to as many questions as we can as we're going. Tricia will be monitoring questions and answering some, and the rest of us will be monitoring too. At the end of the presentation, we'll try to answer some questions live. So we'll try to get to as many as we can. The presenters today for this training are from the compliance team and the FFCR division. My name is Kathy Lovett, and I'll start with some introductory info. And then the project lead, Saida, and another team member, Ashley, will provide some specific details on completing and submitting the ACW. And Tricia is going to monitor the Q&A for us. And so let's get started. We'll jump into the agenda. So our agenda today includes several topics. We're going to talk about the role of the USDE in our indirect cost rate process, the ICRP and the ICRP ACW overview, the timeline, which is very important so that you can meet the deadlines. We'll talk about completing the ACW, submitting the ACW, the ICRP next steps, and how to review and certify the ICRP. We want to start off by showing you where to find resources. This is a copy of the indirect cost rate webpage. And on this webpage, there are a lot of resources. You'll find the actual ACW additional cost workbook, Excel workbook listed here, the link to that. There's an instruction manual, there's an FAQ document. And then this these PowerPoint slide deck is also included here on the indirect cost rate webpage. So any questions that you have probably will be answered if you go to these resources. And we'll try to answer a bunch of questions in the training today. And then as always, you can reach out to us. I'm going to give a little bit of background about the USDE methodology. Our indirect cost rate calculation methodology is dictated by federal laws and the USDE. USDE actually designates TEA as the cognizant agency for indirect costs for local education agencies and education service centers. Of course, local education agencies or LEAs, that refers to school districts and charter schools. And then of course, the education service centers are the 20 service centers that serve all of the LEAs in the state. The USDE actually is in a, and TEA are have something called a delegation agreement. This is an agreement that we make with USDE where they approve our method and our procedures for calculating indirect cost rates. Our agreement with USDE changed as of the 2018-2019 school year, but the newest delegation agreement we received was on 11/29/2019. And that newest delegation agreement is in effect for 5 years, and that's through the 24-25 school year. So the reason our procedures and our forms are pretty consistent is because those are approved by USDE, and we can't really change our process without a new delegation agreement. So our current processes will be in effect through the 24-25 issuance of rates. Here's an overview of our USDE delegation agreement for beginning with the school year 2020, 2021 and beyond. We received that newest delegation agreement from USDE that specifies the approved indirect cost rate calculation methodology. And in that agreement, USDE reaffirmed and clarified the current procedures in the LEA plan. That's the LEA plan is how TEA issues rates to LEAs. It prohibited indirect cost rate extensions. Some of you that have been doing this for a while may remember some years back we did have a time when we were providing extensions of rates, but the current agreement does not allow that. There are no extensions. It rescinded any existing indirect cost rate extensions that were in effect at that time. And their requirement is that rates be requested by school districts every year. And it required that TEA calculates rates every year. And in that calculation every year of rates, it requires 3 years of financial data to calculate the 1-year rates. And you'll see how that enters in later on when CITA talks about the ACW and the ICRP and how we're averaging 3 years of rates. So, and there are 2 rate types that we issue, an unrestricted rate and a restricted rate. The unrestricted rate is applied to grants that are not subject to the federal supplement, not supplant requirement. And the restricted rates are used for grant programs where the supplement, not supplant requirement applies. And keep in mind that most of the grants that TEA administers are subject to supplement, not supplant. And usually the restricted indirect cost rate is applied to them. The restricted rates are lower, of course, than the unrestricted rates. Indirect cost rate proposal overview. The indirect cost rate proposal was updated to accommodate 3 years of financial data. And this was based on the delegation agreement that USDE said we had to include those 3 years of financial data. But because the data increased from providing 1 year of data to 3 years, our division tried to find ways to make it easier for LEAs and to minimize the amount of data that they had to provide. So our current process is that districts no longer complete the ICRP Instead, they complete the ICRP additional cost workbook, or what we call the ICRP ACW. So that's how we'll refer to it throughout, the ICRP ACW. And, and then TEA will pre-populate the ICRP for each district that requests indirect cost rates through submission of the ICRP ACW. The ACW was streamlined last year. In 21-22, the ICRP was streamlined, and the current year process follows the same format. The district's first step is to complete and submit the ICRP ACW to request indirect cost rate. This is the cue to TEA that you are requesting an indirect cost rate is your submission of the ACW. And to receive rates for the 2022-2023 school year, next school year, the due date to submit the ACW is January the 19th, 2022. Once we receive the ACW, TEA will pre-populate the ICRP with the following data. So approximately 10% of the ICRP will be pre-populated from the ACW data submitted by the district. And then the approximate other remaining 90% is pre-populated from PEIMS data. So that's how we tried to assist LEAs in reducing the amount of data they had to submit. We knew we could pull some of that data from PEIMS, so we're pulling some of it from PEIMS. The data that we're requesting in the ACW is data that we cannot get from PEIMS, and so that's why it has to be reported by the district. And then districts, okay, go back, Saida. Okay, so we will pre-populate the ICRP by merging those two data sets, the ACW data and the PEIMS data, and then districts will be required to review and certify the completed ICRPs. So this is a timeline. It's a good summary to cue school districts about when things are due. So November 4th was when the ICRP ACW was made available on the indirect cost rate webpage and in GFFC reports and data collections through TEAL. That's when the TAA, or to the administrator address letter, went out announcing the opening of the project and the availability of the ACW. Now on January the 19th, 2022, that's the due date for districts to submit the ACW, and that is your request for an indirect cost rate. That's an important date for school districts to remember, January 19th. January through April is when our team reviews all the submitted ACWs and requests clarification and or resubmissions as necessary. Then on or before April 21st, next spring, TEA will provide the completed ICRPs to districts for review and certification. And then on May 20th is the due date for districts to submit ICRP certification in GFFC reports and data collections. So you see, it's a two-step process, and the important dates, districts have two important action items to do, and that's on January the 19th when the ACW is due. And then the next important deadline for districts is May 20th. So just by submitting the ACW does not mean you're through with the indirect cost rate process. You still have to, after TEA merges that data and then provides the ICRPs for your review, we upload those into GFFC reports and you'll be able to look at them. And after you look at them, then you must certify that ICRP in order for it to actually become final. And that due date for districts is May 20th. Once we get all that sorted out, we're planning to issue those notification letters of indirect cost rates. And then we also post a list on our website of the final indirect cost rates for 2022, 2023. And July 1, 2022 is the effective date for those new rates. So that's a broad summary and a review of the timeline. I'm gonna toss it over to Saida and Ashley, who will go through the steps of completing the ACW. Saida. You're muted.
Thank you, Kathy. And good afternoon, everyone. In the next following slides, I'll be covering the different tabs the ACW worksheet have and the information being requested. So this is the first tab, and this is the LCA information and certification of additional costs. Enter the following information for the ISD to certify that all submitted data is true and accurate. So the first one is the name of LEA. You need to select your ISD name from the pull down field. And when you do that, the county district number or the CDN will populate. And the name of the LEA in the CDN will also populate to the header of each worksheet on all of the tabs going forward. Name of the primary contact person, that would be the person completing the worksheet. And if we have any questions regarding the data submitted in the ACW, this will be the person we'll contact. And the title, the phone number, the email address, and the date of completion and submission of the ACW. So this is the first tab. Last year, we added a checklist. This checklist tab is to assist LEAs complete their ACW. The checklist answers and clarifies some of the questions that might come up when completing the workbook. And our hope is, again, LEAs will continue to use this tab to review their data entry before submitting their ICRP ACW. It highlights all of the tabs and the sections of the ACW that need to be completed by LEAs before they submit their workbook to to TEA. So like I said, this is just to assist LEAs, just to let you know what are the tabs and what information is being requested in each tab. Next, we have the organizational chart sample tab, which contains an example of the kind of org chart that districts must submit for fiscal year 2021. The process for submitting the org chart is the same as last year. And the next tab is the org chart worksheet. And this is where districts can insert their org chart into the worksheet. And how to insert the org chart is actually found within the tab right here in the highlighted sections. So previously, districts will submit a separate document in GFFC reports and data collection. That is not required anymore, since you'll be inserting the org chart right here in the workbook. And of course, the org chart must support the Chief Executive Officer information on the additional cost fiscal year 21 tab that we'll be reviewing next. So therefore, this year, the LEAs need to submit fiscal year 21 or school year 2020-2021 org chart in this tab. This is the additional cost worksheet. And like Kathy mentioned earlier, 2018-2019 school year was the first year TA implemented the required 3 years of financial data to calculate that 1 year rates. If your district requested rates since the new process has been implemented, you would have seen 3 additional cost worksheet, one for each fiscal year required to be included in the ICRP during your ICRP ACW process. We'll discuss the review process a little later on. If your district received indirect cost rate for 21-22 school year and is requesting again for 22-23 school year, you'll only have to submit one additional cost worksheet for fiscal year 21 or the 2021 school year data, because we have retained the data you already submitted for the previous 2 years, which is the 18-19 and the 19-20 financial data that is required. But if your district did not receive rates for 21-22 school year, then you'll have to submit the 3 years worth of additional cost data, which is the fiscal year 19, fiscal year 20, and 21, and or for whichever years TA does not have data for your district. If that is the case, you'll need to email us so we can provide you with a 3 year worth of financial data request workbook. So it's different than the single year if you have requested rates for 21-22. Another thing to note here is that fiscal year noted in the heading of the worksheet, make sure that it matches the data you'll be entering in this section of the ACW. As discussed in the previous slide, first year is the only year districts are required to submit 3 years worth of data. In subsequent years, the district will be required to provide data only for 1 year for the years not previously submitted. Districts should run accounting system queries to retrieve most of the requested information. We recommend that a staff member familiar with the accounting system queries should complete the workbook. No cost analysis or classification of cost is required by the district. One thing I would like to note here is leaving a section blank or incomplete could result in the delay of the district receiving indirect cost rates due to incomplete information. And if there are no costs to report in a section, please indicate a 0 as the expenditure amount. In the next few slides, I'll provide example of type of queries to run to obtain the financial data being requested in the workbook. The first section is Function 41, General Governance and Direct Costs. So in this section, you enter the expenditure for org codes, the org code 702, 703, and 720 by fund, function, and object code as requested here in the worksheet. Except for excluded cost and org 720 direct cost, expenditure within function 41 are treated as indirect costs for the indirect cost rate calculation. When calculating the indirect cost rates, expenditure within the function 41 are treated as follows. So we have org 702 school board that's excluded cost, org 703 tax office is excluded cost, and org 720 direct cost is direct cost. So over here, I will give you 2 examples of queries in the section that you'll need to run to obtain the information. So for line item 1, Fund 100, Function 41, Object 6100 for 702 School Board. For this line item, 2 queries are needed. Query expenditure for Fund 100, Function 41, Object 6100, Org 702, and Fund 100, Function 41, Object 6144, Org 702. From the resulting amounts, you need to deduct the Object 6144 total, since that's excluded from the Object 6100 total, and then you report the amount in the corresponding line item cell. The second example would be for line item 2, Fund 100, Function 41, Object 6200 for 703 tax office. 1 query is needed in this instant, and the query expenditure for Fund 100, Function 41, Object 6200 for Org 703. And then you report the amount in the corresponding line item cell. Next, the next section is TRS on behalf payments and or Medicare Part D payments. Enter the expenditure for all TRS on behalf payments and or Medicare Part D payments made during the applicable fiscal year by the appropriate, again, fund, function, and object 6144 code as requested here in the worksheet. These payments are considered excluded in the indirect cost rate calculation. And then an example query for this section would be, again, we'll use line item 1, for example, Fund 100, Object 6144 for Function 1X. 1 query is needed, and that would be the query expenditure for Fund 100, Function 1X, Object 6144, and then you report the amount in the corresponding line item cell. Food and meal costs of food service program. So you here again, you'll enter all food and milk expenditure in the food service program made during the applicable fiscal year by the appropriate fund, function and object. Over here, the object code is 6341 as requested in the worksheet. If the district has food and meal cost coded to Fund 700, that will be entered in the amount, in the amount under Food Service Enterprise Fund. An example query over here would be for line item 1, Fund 100, object 6341 for function 3X. The query expenditure that will be needed would be for Fund 100, function 3X, object 6341. Then you report the amount in the corresponding line item cell. Expenditures for food and milk in a food service program are also considered excluded costs in the indirect cost rate calculation. Next, we have depreciation expense amounts. Enter the total depreciation expense charged to governmental activities for buildings and improvements, furniture, equipment, and vehicles. Depreciation expense is a critical expense to report and is required. So under or over reporting the depreciation amount can distort the indirect cost rate significantly. So the district must enter the depreciation amounts for the total cost for both buildings and improvements, furniture, equipment, and vehicles. And of course, the total amount cannot exceed the net depreciation amount listed for the assets as reported in the notes to the financial statement section. The information needed to complete the depreciation expense amount section can be found in the notes to the financial statement section of your district's annual financial report under capital assets or capital asset activity. And over here, we have an example of a capital asset activity from a sample district and how the costs are broken down and reported. So you'll need to determine the increase for buildings and improvements and capital lease if applicable and itemized, determine the increase for furniture, equipment, and vehicles, and then ensure that the total increase are equal to the amount of depreciation charged to governmental activities. Then of course, review the expense charged to governmental activities and note any charge to federal funds, and remove any federal funds, and then report the rest in this section. The next section in the ACW is payments to fiscal agent, member districts of shared service arrangements or SSAs. And it's only requesting that you report federal funds. So you answer yes or no to the question, did the LEA make payments to fiscal agent and or member districts of an SSA funded with federal grant funds from function 93? Please note that the question is asking about payments from federal grant funds. Many districts are participating in a non-federally funded SSAs. If your answer is no to the question, then you can proceed to the next section as no further data entry is required. But if your answer is yes, then you complete the section by providing the requested details on any payments made to fiscal agents and or member districts of an SSA for, again, noting here, it's only for federally funded SSAs. So the best query to gather this data is a query of payment history for function 93, object 649X. This report will provide the SSA payments by fund and itemize the payments in the worksheet based on the funding source. It is also important to include the CFDA number, as this number confirms that the payment was made with federal funds. If there is no CFDA number, then the payment was not likely made from federal funds and should not be reported here. These payments are considered excluded cost in the indirect cost rate calculation, except for the first $25,000 of each payment, which is counted as direct cost. Although you will need to input the total amount of payments to SSA, the final ICRP will calculate as direct cost only the first $25,000 of each of the payments. The remainder of each payment will be considered excluded cost. Next, we have the federal subrecipient items, federal subgrants, and federal grant pass-through funds. So a subrecipient item is the disbursement of federal grant funds by the district to another entity to carry out a portion or all of a federal grant program. The subrecipient or the payee is the entity to which you distribute funds in a subgrant. One of the questions we get in this section is what is the difference between the federal subgrants and the federal grant pass-through funds? And the little definition we have currently is for subgrant item is when a distribution is made as a result of a federal award to a school district, then to another entity or the subrecipient to carry out part of a federal program. The pass-through funds is when the funds are transferred to the other entities. And an example we have is payment to a fiscal agent or member district of an SSA. The federal subrecipient section is used if your district issued a subgrant for food service program and or other pass-through funds. Funds given to other entities that are not fiscal agents, because we have separated the payments to member district SSAs. Over here, we're requesting that you only input subgrant for food service program and or other pass-through funds. For the purpose of the ICRP ACW, we have separated the payments. Here again, you need to answer yes or no to the question. Did the district distribute federal grant funds as a subgrant or as the federal grant pass-through funds? If your answer is no, then you can proceed to the next section as no further data entry is required. Most districts will answer no to this question, but if the answer is yes, then you complete the section by providing the requested details on the subrecipient item. So you need to enter all federal subgrants or other federal grant pass-through funds by selecting the fund, function, and object code under which the payment was made, and then enter the payee name, a description of the subrecipient item, and then here again, you'll need to input the CFDA number, the begin and end dates, and then finally the amount. The CFDA number confirms that the payment was made with federal funds. And like I mentioned on the previous slide, if there is no CFDA number, then the payment was not likely made from federal funds and should not be reported here. For the purpose of the ICRP, TEA is only concerned with major subgrants and has adapted the accepted definition that a major subgrant is one that exceeds $25,000 in expenditure per year. For this reason, do not include subgrants or subcontracts that are less than $25,000. And then you do not also include the first $25,000 of payments in subgrants or subcontracts that are greater than $25,000. One thing I would like to note here is districts will not have subgrants or grant pass-through funds on educational grants. However, districts may have subgrants or grant pass-through funds on non-educational grants awarded by another agency. So TA is not really expecting to see items entered in this section unless, of course, your district has issued a subgrant for their food service program. And federal subrecipient items are also considered excluded cost in the indirect cost rate calculation, except for that first $25,000 of each payment for a major subgrant, which exceeds $25,000, and that first $25,000 of a major subgrant will be considered as direct cost in the calculation, because these funds still have direct and administrative cost associated with them. Next, we have contingencies. So these are funds set aside for possible future expenses, such as lawsuit settlements or refund to TEA. And a little example that we gave here is a monetary judgment against the districts. And these are excluded costs in the indirect cost rate calculation. So to fill this section, you'll need to select the fund, function, and the object code from the pull-down list, and then you enter a description of the cost and the amount of the contingency. The Chief Executive Officer information. Enter all expenditures for Chief Executive Officers and their immediate support person, the state and local salaries, and the fixed costs by function and position name. These positions should correspond to the org chart that you will be inserting and pasting within that ICRP ACW org chart we looked at earlier. TA will review and verify that the org chart supports the position title and details entered in this section. So in this section, the district enters costs, like he said, related to superintendent and the chief executive officers within the school. So the costs associated with this position, facilities and administrative, within these positions are indirect costs when paid with state and local funds. However, when calculating the restricted indirect cost rate, these costs must be moved from the indirect cost pool to the modified total direct cost, or MTDC, or what we call the base. The MTDC, or the modified total direct cost, it consists of direct and unallowable costs. So the positions that must be reported in this section include the superintendent, the immediate employee or employees who serve as the executive or administrative assistant to the superintendent, all staff members who act as CEO of any component of the district. So a component is an organizational unit that benefits the entire district, regardless of their actual titles. This includes a member of your district's wide strategic planning or executive management team or the superintendent's cabinet. On a district's organizational chart, CEOs are generally one level below the superintendent, although in large districts, we've seen CEOs maybe 2 levels below the superintendent, and they generally hold job titles such as assistant superintendent, deputy superintendent, chief financial officer, and human resource executive director. And you'd also need to list the immediate employee or employees who serve as the administrative or executive assistants to the CEO positions. So the information that you'll need to enter for each position is, the first thing is you select the function code from which the indirect salary fixed costs are paid from the pull down list. Then you list the position title, the salary amount paid from state and local funds, the fixed cost amount paid from state and local funds, the staff count for the position. If the position is funded from multiple functions, then you need to enter multiple line items for the position, but you'll only enter one on one line item under staff count or number of positions. And last, we have the terminal leave. So terminal leave is a leave paid to departing employees outside of the normal routine payments for either the accumulation of vacation leave or as part of an employment contract. Again, here, there's a little question at the top. So answer yes or no to the question. Did the LA make payments to one or more departing employees for terminal leave? If your answer is no, then the section is complete and no further data entry is required. If the answer is yes, then you complete the section by providing the requested expenditure for each employee by providing the fund, function, object from which the payment was made, and the location of the job, the title, and then the name of the employee, and also select from the pull down the direct or indirect nature of the employee and the amount paid. Most districts do not have terminal leave because most do not provide formal vacation leave. And this brings us to the last section of the ACW. And now I'm going to pass it to Ashley to go over some of the common mistakes we've come across in our review process, and as well as talk about what the next steps are, and once your district has completed their ACW.
Thank you, Saida. So just as Saida mentioned, I'll be going over some common mistakes that our team has reviewed from past submissions of districts. And I will be kind of reiterating some of the details that Saida had previously mentioned on some of the sections. But just keep in mind that these are just reminders in regards to these specific areas of common mistakes. So we'll go ahead and start off with this depreciation expense. We have reviewed some in the past that were either blank or there was under or over reported amounts. And as mentioned before, it is a very important area to report an expense in this depreciation area, as it may delay processing times. And if the amount is reported under or over, the depreciation amounts can distort the indirect cost rates. So just a little reminder, to complete this section of depreciation expense, enter the total depreciation charged to governmental funds, which includes expense amounts charged to governmental activities for both buildings improvements and furniture, equipment, and vehicles. Another area to focus on as well would be the payments to fiscal agent and or member districts of shared services arrangements, which is also SSAs. So we have seen this section incomplete. So if you could just ensure that in this area to select the answer from the pull down list, either selecting yes or no to the question, did the LEA make payments to a fiscal agent and or a member district of an SSA with federal grants from function 93? So keep in mind that if this is selected as no, then this section is complete. Otherwise, if you do select yes for this question, you must enter all payments made to fiscal agents and or member districts of an SSA. And you can go to the next slide. Okay. And another good area of opportunity to focus on is federal subrecipient items. We have identified incomplete data or no selection from the pull down list. So again, just ensure that you're selecting from the pull down list. It is located at the right-hand side of the data sheet. You'll select yes or no to the question. Did the school district distribute federal grant funds as a subgrant or as a federal grant pass-through funds? Again, if selected no, this section is complete. And then if yes, you'll go ahead and provide the required details under the subrecipient items, including the fund, function, and object codes under which the payment was made. And again, just as Saida has mentioned before, you'll enter the payee name, the description, the CFDA number, begin, end date, and the amount. The next section under contingencies, this is another good area to focus on to ensure a selection is made from the pull down list. You'll select the fund, function, and object code from pull down list. Enter all expenditures the district has within its total governmental expenditures. Last but not least, under Chief Executive Officer information, we do get a lot of questions asked in regards to what position titles are applicable to this section. So just ensure that you're selecting the function code from the pull down list, the position title, the salary amount paid. This is from state and local funds, fixed cost amount paid from state and local funds, the staff count for each position listed on this as well. Some good examples that just pulled up here on this slide would be campus principals. I'm sorry, these are examples that should not be listed under the CEO. So campus principals, special education programs, federal programs, transportation programs, food service programs, art programs, board of trustees. We do have an awesome FAQ document that you can access, and on pages 10 and 11, you'll be able to see a more in detail of what positions are not applicable for this specific area. Okay, and now we'll go ahead and discuss how to submit the ICRP ACW. So in completing the following steps, you'll submit for your specific district's ICRP ACW to TEA. You'll go ahead and log into our TEA login, which in this case is teal. You'll select GFFC reports and data collections. Select upload response documents. You'll then see the ICRP additional cost workbook from the response template title. You'll use the pull down menu, and please ensure, just as a side note, that the workbook must be submitted in Excel format. You'll then select the response document from the response document type pull down menu. You'll select the school year for which you are requesting. So in this case, it would be the 22, I'm sorry, this is a tongue twister, 2022 to 2023 school year. And that's, of course, if you're submitting in the fall of 21 or spring of 22. You'll then select upload document. And the next steps would be that once all the submission is completed, to receive indirect cost rates for 2022-2023, districts must submit the ICRP ACW by January 19th of 2022, which is a very important date. TEAs, our division would then collect all the 2020-2021 PEMS data in the spring of 2022 to complete the data needed to create the ICRP. And we will then merge the district submitted ICRP ACW data with the PEMS data to create and pre-populate the complete ICRP. And finally, TEA will post the complete ICRPs into GFFC reports for districts to review. Districts will be required to review and certify acceptance of resulting indirect cost rates. So please ensure that you do certify the acceptance. That is another step in the process that is required. And then districts will receive their new rates, which will become effective July 1st of 2022. And at this time, I'll go ahead and return this back to Saida to go ahead and review the remaining of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. In the remaining few slides that we have, I'll cover the steps on how to review the indirect cost rate proposal, and that TA will post in GFFC, and how to submit the ICRP certification Ashley just mentioned. So reviewing the ICRP certification financial worksheet. When first generated, the ICRP is an Excel form, which will be converted into a PDF format, and that is what will be uploaded into GFFC for your review. And when reviewing the ICRP, you'll notice that the pages are labeled at the bottom of each page. And the first few pages is the U1 all pages, which are found on pages 2 to 3. And this is a summary of the unrestricted rates data average for all 3 years. Next, you have the R1 all years, R1 all years, which are found on pages 5 to 6. And this will be the summary of the restricted rate data average for all 3 years. Next, we have the restricted rate adjustment all. This page will show the average for all 3 years of indirect cost rate adjustments. What these are the costs that are moved from the indirect cost pool to the modified total cost. On the U1, ISD expenditures are classified as either excluded and allowable direct or indirect costs based on fund, function, and object. And the cost classified as indirect costs on the U1 tab used for the unrestricted rate calculation then are adjusted to determine the restricted rate. And this is where that calculation happens. So section 4 of the restricted rate adjustment all provides the average amount that is moved from the indirect cost pool to the modified total direct cost on the restricted rate calculation tab. And then sections 1 to 3 provide a visual average and not the actual amounts applied, because the actual percentage and amounts were applied on each fiscal year respectively. The actual percentage and amounts were applied on each fiscal year. Then the resulting section 4 of each fiscal year were added together and divided by 3 in the section 4 of the restricted rate adjustment to 3-year average financial information. Again, this section 4 provides the average amount that is moved from the indirect cost pool to the modified total direct cost on the restricted rate calculation tab. Pages 7 to 18 contain the supporting data for each of the 3 fiscal year and shows the average data elements which were used to produce the resulting rates. So it has, this is, like I said, the financial worksheets. So it has the additional cost workbook that was submitted by your district and the PIMS data, the PIMS financial data that TA pooled. For year 1 or fiscal year 2019, those pages are found on pages 7 to 10. For year 2 or fiscal year 2020 for this year are found on pages 11 to 14. And then year 3 would be the fiscal year 2021, which is found on pages 15 to 18. That brings us to the last page of the ICRP. That completes the ICRP review process. And next, we'll look at how to fill out and submit the ICRP certification. One thing I would like to mention here is that the ICRP certification is different from the ACW certification. The ACW certification is, again, it will certify that all the submitted data is accurate in the ACW and has the contact information of the person completing the workbook that we will reach out to if we have any questions or need any clarification. But the ICRP certification that you see here is the district certification of the information contained within the proposal. And it is the first page of the ICRP. And to accept and finalize your district rates, this certification of indirect costs must be completed, signed, and submitted back to TEA. The certification must be signed by the school district's superintendent, the chief executive officer, or the chief financial officer. And certification must be, again, for the correct school year. So it's going to have to be, if you're applying for the 2022-2023 rates, it has to be indexed under that school year. And submission of this ICRP certification is the district's last step to be issued indirect cost rate for the next school year. And to complete the certification, we currently ask that you print that certification page, enter the required information, have the superintendent or CFO sign and date the printed page, then scan the signed and dated page and upload the scanned certification into GFFC reports as ICRP certification. And the steps to do that is you complete the following steps to submit your school district certification. Again, you need to log on to TL, select GFFC reports and data collections, upload response document, select ICRP certification from the response template, title, pull-down menu, then select response document from the response doc type pull-down menu, and then select the school year 22-23 from the school year pull-down menu, and then select upload document. It's again, I'm going to emphasize the point here. It's very important to index the title of the document that you're uploading, and make sure that you're uploading it for the correct school year, so that when we pull down data, your school will be captured in our data set. Then once we receive your district's certification, ICRP certification, we will post the approved certified indirect cost rate on the indirect cost rates webpage and upload individual district notification letters into GFFC reports and data collection. And this brings us to the end of the process for requesting and issuing indirect cost rate for school districts. And before we start answering some questions in the Q&A, I would like to review the timeline of events one more time, just because it's very important to meet the deadlines. Again, the ACW was made available to districts by November 4, and the due date to submit the completed ACW is January 19, 2022. Then we'll post the completed ICRPs by April 21 in GFFC reports and data collection, and that should give districts about 30 days to review and certify and certify acceptance of the resulting indirect cost rate by May 2022. So that is when the ICRP certifications are due back to TA. Then we'll post the official rates by July 1, 2022. And these the rates are effective from July 1, 2022 through June 30th of 2023. And this brings us to the end of our presentation. And now, like I said, we'll try and address some of the questions in the Q&A. And if after this, you have some other questions, of course, you could always email us at compliance@tea.texas.gov.
Saida, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A that weren't already answered. So one of them is and it's about doing queries. It says when we see Fund 100, should that be 1XX in our query?
So yes, it will be 1XX, or I was using 100, but that is correct. It could be 1XX, which represents the 100 to 199. So yes, is there any other questions in the Q&A?
Yes, there's one about, so when you were talking about federal subrecipient items, there's a question here about, would this involve a food service company? So talk about if they contract for food services, where that appears in the ACW.
So if they contract, that is actually one of the examples I gave. I'm trying to go back to that subrecipient slide so we can have it up. But yes, so an instant where the example we gave to districts to use this, where we see amounts is for food services, right? So if they have a food service program, this would be, if it's not in the food service section, then this would be the other section where if they are paying somebody else to provide that service, this would be where they would input that data.
And that's all the questions right now. If anybody has any other questions, please type them into the Q&A. For contingencies, would that include legal settlement agreements? Contingencies.
I'm going to have to do research on that, because as we have it now, it's money set aside. I don't know if that includes payments. So if the person that asked that question, if you could please email us at compliance.texas.gov, we will do some research and get back to you, because like I said, what we have is a set aside fund and not expenditure or payments for that section currently. Any other questions or?
I think that's it.
Thank you, everyone. We really do appreciate you joining us this afternoon. And thank you for your time. And please reach out if you have any questions, and me or any member of my team will be more than glad to help and assist you. So thank you.